All right, people. Podcast number 2. We're going to get deep into it now. I have all sorts of interesting news to share. All sorts of interesting news. Over 1,000 whistleblowers silenced. Probably didn't hear about that, did you? It's time to unleash Inspector Generals. Podcast number 2. When it comes to fixing systemic government corruption, when it comes to fighting back against corruption, there is a very powerful accountability mechanism built into the United States government that is being completely ignored. And this will show you how corrupt both parties are and how corrupted the mainstream media has become. There is a very powerful accountability mechanism built into the core functioning of the United States government that no one wants to talk about. Every agency within the United States government has their very own Inspector General. Every agency and department within the United States government has their very own independent Inspector General. Inspector Generals exist to combat corruption. That is their mandate. It is their job to detect and investigate fraud, to detect and investigate abuses of power, unethical actions, and corrupt activity. It is their job to detect and investigate corruption within the particular agency that they specialize in. Inspector Generals have full power, full legal authority to investigate corruption in every government agency, in every department. Every document that every government agency has, everything every agency does, every move that an agency makes, the Inspector General of that agency has full legal authority to know about it and investigate it. This is it, people. This is our crucial access point. This is how we can effectively combat systemic government corruption. Inspector Generals are a linchpin accountability mechanism that we can use to take our government back from the corrupt. And it is a way that 99.99% of Americans can agree on. As our government has grown in corruption, Inspector Generals have had their budgets and staffs cut drastically. Surprise, surprise, anyone who engages in corruption anywhere in our government absolutely does not want an Inspector General around. So corrupt politicians have cut their budgets, and many key head Inspector General positions have not been filled. You can tell how corrupt our mainstream media system is too. You can see the absolute death of real journalism in this country when it comes to the lack of coverage on all the vital work that Inspector Generals do. The mainstream media has had a blackout on most of the work that Inspector Generals have been doing. Inspector Generals have been calling out billions upon billions of dollars in fraud throughout our tax system. Billions upon billions of tax dollars are lost to fraud every year. Inspector Generals have been exposing outrageous corruption in report after report, but the mainstream media totally ignores them. There are so many examples of this, which I will be covering in detail throughout this series. Inspector Generals even provide solutions. When they see waste, when they see how fraud is happening, when they see loopholes in policy that lead to corruption, when they see abuse of power, they investigate it and provide solutions. However, our politicians are so corrupt, they often don't implement the solutions. It's outrageous. We have fixes solutions on the books, solutions that can literally save us billions upon billions of tax dollars every single year. Yet they aren't implemented. Trillions of tax dollars are flying out the door. It's the wild, wild west on steroids. It's a gold rush courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer. It's the plunder of the U.S. Treasury for real. It's peak corruption. The bottom line, though, if we can shine a light on the work that inspector generals are doing, we can deploy this vital linchpin governmental accountability mechanism and throw a serious wrench into the gears of corruption. This is our back door. This is the American people's back door into combating corruption. With elections, the electoral door has been significantly rigged shut. Campaign finance, dark money, gerrymandering, rigged primaries, superdelegates, closed debates, privately controlled voting machines, various forms of voter suppression, and on and on and on. We are being very effectively locked out of the electoral process, the electoral door. Well, as it turns out, there is a back door for us, a linchpin accountability mechanism that we need to focus on. Inspector generals are the American people's key weapon in taking on the predatory global interests that have taken control of both political parties. This is why the mainstream media ignores their work. This is why corrupt politicians and corrupt government officials are cutting inspector generals' budgets and stopping them from filling pivotal leadership positions. The global power elite are trying to lock us out of the electoral process, so inspector generals are the American people's back door into combating corruption. You know the so-called deep state, this permanent shadow government that seems to be controlling everything in secrecy, these unelected, unaccountable imperial interests who operate in secrecy? Well, guess what? The deep state shadow government really doesn't want inspector generals around. Vital inspector general positions within deep state agencies haven't been filled. Their inspector generals have been mysteriously fired. All sorts of highly suspect activities around Department of Defense inspector generals have been going on. And it's no surprise as to why. You see, inspector generals have full legal authority to know everything that these secretive agencies have been doing. Interesting. Just like the NSA has a backdoor into our private lives, well, as it turns out, we have a backdoor into theirs as well. Shh. You're not supposed to know about it. Shh. No one's supposed to know. No one's supposed to talk about it. Shh. Independent inspector generals. This is where the action is at, people. The 20 trillion with a T, the 20 trillion in unaccounted for so-called military spending that I have been reporting on, that info comes from the Department of Defense Inspector General. Now, here's a little known fact on that, a little known detail. Since the Department of Defense Inspector General reported $6.5 trillion in unaccounted for military spending in 1 year? You heard that right. The Department of Defense Inspector General reported $6.5 trillion in unaccounted for military spending in 1 year. Since then, since that report, the Department of Defense has not had a head inspector general. Since the Department of Defense Inspector General reported $6.5 trillion in unaccounted for military spending in 1 year, surprise, surprise, what do you know? There has not been a head inspector general at the Department of Defense since then. Interesting how that works. And to make matters even worse, the head of whistleblowing and source protection at the Department of Defense's Inspector General office was abruptly, scandalously fired. What do you know? Funny how that works. I will have much more to say about this in a minute. Let me first stress, we need to highlight the work of inspector generals. The work they have already done, investigations that they are doing, and what they need to do. We need to make sure that they remain independent and that they get proper funding and staffing. We need to make sure that all the key head positions are filled by independent people as they are legally required to be. We need to make sure that investigations are taking place. We need to make sure that solutions are being implemented. Inspector generals need to become a primary political focus, a primary political narrative. When the government is overrun in systemic corruption, inspector generals are of critical, paramount importance. And this is something that most all Americans can agree to and get behind. 99.99% of America does not want a corrupt government. 99.99% of America does not want to have their tax dollars stolen. And inspector generals exist to combat corruption, to make sure that tax dollars are appropriated and spent correctly. That's what they do. Combating corruption is their mandate, to combat corruption and abuse of power. As I said in the previous podcast, the only dividing line that matters right now is between those who are in on the corruption and those who are not. And 99.99% of the population is not in on the corruption. Okay, that being said, now let's get further into this right now. Let's drive home the point. In partnership with the Office of the Inspector General, we also need to highlight the work of the Government Accountability Office. The Government Accountability Office has been putting out report after report on shocking corruption. The Government Accountability Office primarily examines how taxpayer dollars are spent, but they also serve a vital watchdog role when it comes to overall corruption. For example, number one of many, in the past year alone, the Government Accountability Office has uncovered over $70 billion, with a B, over $70 billion in wasteful spending. In the past year alone, the government accountability has uncovered over $70 billion in wasteful spending in one fiscal year. Meanwhile, they are tragically underfunded as well. For every $1 spent on the Government Accountability Office, they save us $130 in fraud and waste. And this is the budget that gets cut. For every $1 they get, they give us $130. Yeah, let's cut their funding. Can you say peak corruption? With budget management like that, it's no wonder we have an all-time record-breaking national debt of over $21 trillion. And the same thing can be said for the Office of the Inspector General's gutted budget. And also congressional investigation committees having their funding slashed. The ROI, the return on investment, when it comes to funding accountability mechanisms within our government is outstanding. It's the best bang for our buck that we can get. And yet, this is where big cuts in funding are occurring. What do you know? Meanwhile, where the most corruption is taking place, where we get the least bang for our buck, that's where funding is increasing. Can you say peak corruption? Peak corruption, people. It's global imperial plunder. That's what it is. Let's keep driving this point home. We're just getting warmed up. To understand how the Government Accountability Office and the Office of the Inspector General can team up to be the American people's wonder twins when it comes to combating corruption, and to further understand how budget cuts to inspector generals are destroying their ability to investigate known corruption, here's another recent example of mind-blowing corruption that they recently revealed. Here is some surreal corruption for you. Put your seatbelt on for this one. The Government Accountability Office just released a report revealing that a stunning 1,197 whistleblower complaints were filed at the Department of Defense Inspector General Office over a 3-year period. That is 1,197 whistleblower complaints formally filed in only 3 years. On average, that is more than one whistleblower stepping forward every single day, 365 days a year. For 3 years. That is more than one whistleblower complaint being formally filed at the Department of Defense Inspector General Office every single day, 365 days a year, at just the Pentagon. This isn't throughout the entire government. This is just at the Pentagon, just at the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. But wait, the story gets much crazier the more you look into it. Guess how many of these whistleblower complaints were not followed up on or investigated at all? Guess how many of the 1,197 whistleblower complaints were mysteriously closed without any investigation at all? 1,094. 1,094 whistleblower complaints that were filed, formally, officially filed, were never looked into or investigated at all. They were immediately shut down and silenced. Please think this through. That's over 1,000 whistleblowers recently stepping forward in just the Pentagon that were completely ignored, silenced. 1,094 whistleblower complaints that were never followed up on or investigated. That is 91% of the whistleblower complaints that were filed at the Pentagon. 91% of whistleblower complaints that are formally filed at the Department of Defense Inspector General Office are never investigated. This means that one very brave whistleblower steps forward every single day, 365 days a year, and they are completely ignored. It's mind-blowing. And this is the norm. The unthinkable has become normalized. It's surreal corruption. Now, it's vital that you understand the full context here. There are a couple more significant layers to this, to say the least. Let me start by giving some more context on the act of blowing the whistle in the first place. You have to understand, within the military, the Pentagon, and intelligence community, people are very reluctant to file a whistleblower complaint to begin with. They know the odds are that they are going to be retaliated against. There are many cases of retaliation. Retaliation has become a huge scandal. Retaliation has become an epidemic. It's the norm now. For whistleblowers, the odds are that they are going to be demoted. They will probably be reassigned to awful assignments as punishment at best. They may be dishonorably discharged. Their reputation will be smeared. There are solid odds that their career will be over. They may even lose the ability to make a living at all, which has happened in cases. There is tremendous risk in filing a whistleblower complaint, especially when you work in the Pentagon. So most people don't do it to begin with. The percentage of people who see corruption and then actually go and file a formal complaint with the Defense Department Inspector General Office, that percentage is tiny, a tiny fraction to begin with. Yet, we still get more than one brave and incredibly courageous whistleblower stepping forward every single day, 365 days a year. And they are completely ignored. Every single day, a whistleblower is silenced. Every single day, 365 days a year, a whistleblower is silenced. What is happening? What is happening here? But wait. There's much more that needs to be said. To make matters even worse, as I briefly mentioned before, the head of whistleblowing and source protection at the Department of Defense Inspector General Office was abruptly fired last year under scandalous circumstances. Plus, as I said before, key positions in the DoD and Intel Community Inspector General's office haven't been filled. And of course, potential whistleblowers know about all this. So you see, it takes a lot, to say the least. It is a huge risk to formally file a whistleblower complaint. And on top of all of this, yes, it gets even worse. This is surreal corruption, people. On top of all of this now, potential whistleblowers know that the CIA is illegally, unconstitutionally surveilling Congress when Congress talks to whistleblowers. Yes, you heard that correct. So much for constitutional checks and balances. The CIA is surveilling Congress when they talk to whistleblowers, which, oh, by the way, is a major violation of the U.S. Constitution. So, bottom line, most people who are seeing corruption are not blowing the whistle. Yet, we've had over 1,000 courageous whistleblowers step forward who were ignored and silenced. Can you say peak corruption? So, to give context on this part of the scandal, the handful of whistleblowers who managed to get their cases investigated, what happens with the select few who don't get immediately shut down and silenced? The few who strategically maneuver through the cracks? Well, recently, Senator Grassley is the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. This is the Senate Judiciary Committee now. You know, as a side note here, when you have trillions of dollars in unaccounted for military spending, you go to the Senate Judiciary Committee for Justice. That's the way the constitutional checks and balances work. So, in this latest example, you had whistleblowers going to the Senate in hopes of bringing some very rare accountability, but it turned out that they were being illegally surveilled by the CIA. The CIA was surveilling congressional staff interactions with whistleblowers. So the CIA was able to stay one step ahead and manipulate the process. And they ended up effectively countering and shutting down the congressional investigation into those whistleblower complaints. And these were the few whistleblower complaints that were actually investigated and followed up on at all. These were the few that slipped through the cracks and actually got partially looked into. And even worse, the CIA was able to classify the fact that they were even caught spying on Congress. And oh, by the way, yet another major violation of the U.S. Constitution. Congress is supposed to hold the CIA accountable. That's their job. That is a major check and balance. And the CIA is caught spying on Congress. Major violation of the Constitution. And this latest example is certainly not the first time that the CIA was caught illegally spying on Congress. For another example, when Congress was trying to investigate the CIA's torture program, the CIA was caught spying on Congress back then as well. Whoops. We don't need those checks and balances now, do we? There's no need for checks and balances in the land of global imperial rule, is there? For more context now, this is how absurd it is. Senator Grassley, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, he had to fight hard for 4 years just to get this information on the CIA's illegal surveillance of congressional staff interactions with whistleblowers declassified. This has been going on for at least 4 years now. This is how torched the Constitution is now. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary had to fight hard for 4 years to get this scandalous information partially declassified, which he finally just did recently. So this is just the latest example of highly illegal, highly corrupt, highly unconstitutional activity. By the way, another quick side note right now, which I'll get more into in the future. This constitution-destroying power the ability to use national security secrecy to cover up corruption, illegal activity, and to silence whistleblowers. This is the global imperial elite's trump card. They engage in highly corrupt activity, and then they can just cover it up by waving the wand of national security. It's the ultimate get out of jail free card. And we can see it in action right here. The fact that it took 4 years for the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee to be able to publicly say that they were illegally, unconstitutionally being spied on, that's stunning. 4 years for the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee to be able to say that the Constitution was violated in a fundamental way. That's stunning. And even in this egregious case where the CIA completely torched the Constitution, even in this case, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, after 4 years of battling, was only able to get limited information on this issue declassified. Even after all that, the information was finally declassified and it had parts redacted, which Senator Grassley said was completely unnecessary to have it redacted. Senator Grassley is a senior Republican. Then you have Senator Wyden, a senior Democrat, who is on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Wyden has said flat out that information is classified to cover up corruption routinely as standard operating procedure. So this is senior Republican leadership and senior Democratic leadership. The people who are in a position to know what is going on, they are the ones saying this. They are in agreement saying information is being classified to cover up outrageous corruption. Then you even had Senator Chuck Schumer go on national television for a very rare moment of deep truth from Schumer. Schumer went on national television to warn President Trump that he can't hold the intel community accountable because, and I quote now, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you. That was a direct quote said on national television. Do you grasp the absurdity of this? You had the leader of the Democratic Party, a senator, warned the president saying that they can't hold the intelligence community accountable because they have too many ways to get back at you. Game, set, and match, people. Checkmate. The Constitution has been officially torched. This isn't me saying these things. This is the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a senior Republican senator, and a senior Democratic senator on the Intel Committee, and the leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate, warning the Republican president on national television. They are all saying that you cannot hold the intel community accountable. I'll get more into the dynamics of all this in a bit. How the intel community and private military contractors effectively shut down anyone who can hold them accountable. There is much more to say about all this. There are clear-cut examples that I'm getting into in this podcast. Back to the original point here, though, right now. So, potential whistleblowers know about all this. They see firsthand how the chain of accountability is being dismantled and surveilled. And still, we had over 1,000 whistleblowers step forward. And no one even looked into their complaints or investigated them at all. They were just ignored. Over 1,000 whistleblowers were silenced. It is beyond absurd corruption. It's surreal corruption. Peak corruption is the technical term for what's happening right now. Please think about it this way for a minute. Over 1,000 whistleblowers silenced. Over 1,000 whistleblowers stepping forward is huge news. And has anyone in the mainstream media covered any of this at all? Have you heard any politician talking about this? This is a recent report from the Government Accountability Office in partnership with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. They are the primary accountability mechanisms built into the core functioning of our government. They are the ones reporting all of this. Hello? Is anyone out there? Please. SOS. Over 1,000 whistleblower complaints ignored. Over 1,000 whistleblowers silenced, just as trillions of dollars are reported unaccounted for by the Department of Defense Inspector General. And none of this is worthy of any news coverage? It melts your mind. It melts your mind. Can you say global imperial rule? It's global imperial plunder. This is peak corruption, people. Surreal corruption. Salvador Dali could not capture the surreal corruption that is presently unfolding. It is mind-melting corruption hidden in plain sight, in broad daylight. It is mind-melting corruption hidden in surreal sight. It's such outrageous corruption, people don't even take you seriously. This is what I mean by surreal corruption. Look, here's the bottom line. Here's the urgent message for the American people. This is what the American people need to understand. Between the Government Accountability Office, Inspector Generals, and Congressional Investigations Committees, we can very effectively combat corruption and global imperial plunder. And not surprisingly, all three of these key areas, all three of these absolutely vital accountability mechanisms have had their budgets gutted. It's no surprise that corruption is on the rise when these vital accountability mechanisms have been neglected and largely ignored. I'm going to get into detail on all this throughout this series. We're just getting started here. So much vital info to share with you. Are we starting to understand the importance and power of inspector generals? Inspector generals are the avengers for the American people. I know that sounds silly, but I'm trying to put this into a frame of reference so people can understand how powerful and vitally important inspector generals are right now. This is our pivotal access point. Inspector generals are our back door into effectively combating corruption. Inspector generals are our Jedi force. We need to use the force. We need to use this IG force. No joke. We need to shine a light on inspector generals. We need to illuminate the dark side. We need to illuminate the shadows that be. We need to shine a light on inspector generals so they can shine a light on the deep, dark recesses of the corruption that is absolutely destroying our future. Before jumping into the next topic, I want to dive deeper into the role of surveillance technology. This is another major reason why we need to put a huge spotlight on the work of inspector generals. As we've begun to touch on in the first podcast of this series, when it comes to global private military contractors and global intelligence agencies with surveillance technology now, it is real easy for them to manipulate, silence, and control people. This is commonplace now. Politicians all over the world, politicians all throughout the United States, they're targeted and on lockdown now. Anyone in a position of power who can affect the global imperial elite's power in any way, anyone who can hold them accountable in any way is targeted. The primary point here, the power of surveillance technology is vastly underestimated when it comes to how real power operates. I mean, since the days of J. Edgar Hoover, keeping control files on politicians and political adversaries has been the norm. Now, with unprecedented surveillance powers, global intelligence agencies, global private military contractors, and anyone with enough money, they now have the power to know everything about any targeted individuals. And thanks to big data analytics and artificial intelligence algorithms, they can do it with increasing effectiveness on entire populations now. With stunning effectiveness on entire populations now. I've been fighting off hackers, censorship, and many forms of suppression for a long time. With modern surveillance tech, the attacks are much more sophisticated now. You know, with modern surveillance tech, what most people don't realize or think through, surveillance tech is getting so widespread now, anyone with enough money or skill, anyone evil enough can invade every aspect of your personal life and latch on to the slightest personal vulnerability. Just think about it for a minute. Everything you do on your cell phone, every text message, phone call, everything you do online on your laptop, desktop, every email you send, every personal message, every like, comment, every move you make is accessible now. Every credit card transaction, every website visited, every online search, even if you write in a diary or personal journal that is on your phone or your computer, every move you make is accessible now, and the slightest vulnerability can be manipulated and exploited. Think about it. Think it through. If you exchange angry text messages with a spouse or a coworker, if you have personal issues that you're dealing with involving family members, any vulnerability at all can be used against you in not so subtle ways and in very subtle ways as well. any vulnerability whatsoever can be manipulated, provoked, and exaggerated. And here's the kicker. And this is the worst part. Even if you don't have a single skeleton in your closet, even if you live like a saint, even if you are the most transparent, open, and honest person, they can plant things and make things up. They can make it look like you are doing things that you aren't actually doing. From sending messages from your phone or messages from any of your accounts, all the way to deep fakes now. They can even make videos now of you doing things that in reality is not you. They can make videos now of you doing things that you have not done that are indistinguishable from reality. These are called deep fake videos. You may have heard of these or seen them online, but the ones you see online are not nearly as good as the ones major private military and global intelligence agencies can create, if they are evil enough to do it. Most of the time, you don't even need to go that far, though. When you know every personal detail about someone, you can very effectively undermine their personal life in subtle ways. In many ways, you can cause all sorts of personal drama for them. You can easily undermine and tear apart families. It has become disturbingly, shockingly easy to do it if you are evil enough to do it. This is a quickly growing industry now. If you're evil enough to do it, it can be done to anyone. Look, I don't want to get too deep into this aspect right now. I probably already have. People tend to think you are crazy when you get this deep into this. Bottom line, though, they can manipulate you in so many ways. All they need is one little data point, one little vulnerability, and they can rip into your personal life with tactical precision. It is real easy to smear people's reputations, to spread false information, and to blackmail people. It is real easy to silence people. That's the main point. With modern surveillance tech, it is real easy to manipulate, control, and silence people. What people don't realize or think through is that this technology and the ability to invade every aspect of your personal life, the technology to do it now is so widespread. People think about surveillance tech and they think, oh, it's just the NSA who can spy on them and invade their privacy. But the ability to do it now is very widespread. Many intel agencies, private military companies, black market hackers are doing it. It's a booming, thriving industry now. Anyone who doesn't like anything that you are doing, anyone who just wants to make money off of blackmailing people, anyone with enough money or skill, anyone who is evil enough to do it can completely invade every aspect of your life. It's to the point now where everyone has to live knowing that everything they do, even in the privacy of their own home, everything you do is essentially public information, and privacy is effectively dead. The Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution has been rendered null and void when it comes to modern surveillance tech. Modern surveillance tech has obliterated antiquated privacy laws, and the American people are defenseless to this now. So this is what happens to investigative journalists who attempt to hold the powerful accountable. This is why journalism is dead in the United States. And this is another significant reason why our politicians have been reduced to being servants of the global imperial elite. Every significant politician has all sorts of surveillance on them, multi-layers, from intelligence agencies, private military contractors, political opponents, opposition party operatives, and powerful global corporations who are affected by possible government policies and regulations. When it comes to real power, everyone is on lockdown now. Step out of line. Try to bring accountability, and you better be prepared to have your world turned upside down. This is why corruption is now running wild, running amok. For global power players, it's now the wild, wild west, a gold rush courtesy of the American taxpayer. Just think about what we discussed before. Senator Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Democratic Party, you had the leader of the Democratic Party, a sitting senator, go on national television and warn President Trump that he can't take on the intelligence community because they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you. That's a direct quote. It is also vital to point out that many intelligence agencies and global private military contractors also frequently use shell companies to deploy similar tactics on behalf of their wealthy clientele against any adversaries, whether it's political opponents, business rivals, whistleblowers, journalists, or activists, as we will be discussing in detail throughout this series. You have many private military companies who do this, and they often use temporary shell companies that are opened and then shut down to cover their tracks. It's commonplace, much more so than people realize. Even large corporations in general are doing this now. When it comes to the upper echelon of global power, most outsource it to private military contractors who use shell corporations, which they open and close to cover their tracks. You have military and intel community people now who fly through the revolving door with the latest surveillance tech into private military companies, who then use and improve upon that tech. And then the tech is deployed through shell front companies to silence political adversaries. This is how real power operates now. To further understand the point I'm trying to make here, for a revealing, publicly known example, you can look at the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal when they got millions of Facebook users' personal information for the 2016 presidential election. The Facebook data scandal was only one small piece to a much bigger puzzle. The investigations into that scandal struck right to the root of this overall surveillance problem that we're discussing now. Cambridge Analytica was a front company for Strategic Communications Laboratories, SCL. SCL is they're deeply intertwined with British Intel, MI6, SIS, and the CIA as well. They're a very powerful private military company who has a long track record of, let's say, manipulating elections. They have manipulated more than 200 elections, and they brag about it. They say they have conducted behavioral change programs in over 60 countries. Behavioral change. That's what they call it. That's what they do, all right. Anyhow, during the investigations into Cambridge Analytica, their CEO and a top executive who also worked for SCL were recorded on video speaking in a very matter-of-fact, casual way about how they use surveillance tech to spy on people who are running for office and spy on politicians who are already in office. How they spy on them to dig up any dirt on them so they can blackmail them or bribe them to do whatever they want them to do, or to get them to do whatever their clients want them to do. And as they talked about on video, if they can't dig up any dirt, they discussed how they try to entrap politicians using honeypot traps, which means they use prostitutes to entrap politicians. They casually talked about how using sexy Ukrainian women to entrap politicians around the world is a very effective way to do it. Then they said, and this is where it gets scary, then they said, if they can't get any dirt on someone, if they can't even bribe or entrap them, then they just make up information to smear that politician's credibility and undermine that politician's personal life. They openly bragged about putting out fake news online and how effective they are at spreading false information online and through the mainstream media. They have gotten many people elected using these methods throughout the U.S. and all over the world. In more than 200 elections, they brag about it. And SCL is definitely not the only private military contractor or intel company to do this. This is just one example, a publicly revealing look into how real power operates. When you look into this case, you can clearly see how these surveillance technologies are used to control governments worldwide now, especially throughout the United States. And here's another quick example. We have a situation now where all throughout Washington, D.C., you have stingrays set up now. All around the Capitol, stingrays monitor conversations that politicians have. And that's just another current publicly known example. With surveillance tech now, anyone in a position of power, anyone who can defend the American people's interests against the global imperial elite, anyone who can defend Americans' people's interests is targeted. So whether you're a politician or an investigator of any kind, whether you're on a congressional investigation committee, a law enforcement investigator, an inspector general, or an investigative journalist, you will be targeted and very effectively undermined before you can hold the global imperial elite accountable. Anyone who is in any way a threat to powerful interests is now targeted. That's the way it works. So that's why you get the leader of the Democratic Party, a sitting senator, going on national television to warn the president that you can't hold the intel community accountable. You can't hold the global imperial elite accountable. It's a global imperial empire now. A global oligarchy has been enthroned. It's a global centralizing force. They have conquered the third world and the developing world. And now they are conquering the first world. This is what's happening, people. In the unaccountable system of war profiteering, which I outlined in the report that I put out that got me hacked and censored online, I reported on all this in detail as concisely as possible. If I can get that report back up online without getting all hacked for it, you can read all about the details with direct source links and deep background information. The evidence that people need to understand how all this works and plays out is in that Unaccountable System of War Profiteering report. Beyond the underestimated use and power of surveillance, I also pointed out how the system of corruptly implemented legalized bribery has been playing out. When it comes to trillions of dollars of unaccounted for so-called military spending, you can see how the governmental mechanisms of corruption operate. Based on publicly available information, global military companies have spent at least $2.5 billion through lobbying and campaign finance since 1996, when the Pentagon was first supposed to be audited. Over that same time frame, there have also been over 12,000 government officials who have openly cashed out to global military companies and have gone through the revolving door over that short period of time. That is an absurd level of corruption. 12,000 government officials who have gone through the revolving door and have openly cashed out to global military companies in just this short period of time. 12,000! That is an absurd level of blatant corruption. And this is just publicly known info, publicly known revolving door information, and publicly known campaign contributions and lobbying activity from known military companies. There are all sorts of backroom, behind closed doors action, bribing, dark money. You have all these front companies for military and intel companies, shell companies, and then you have PACs and lobby groups that are fronts for military and intel companies. So the problem is actually much worse than what we publicly know here. But what we publicly know is absurd enough. At this point, we don't need any more info to know the score. You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. The emperor has no clothes. The emperor is naked for all who are brave enough to look and see. So with legalized political bribery, you get what we have now. Corruptly implemented laws, corruptly implemented campaign finance, lobbying, and revolving door laws, mixed with surveillance technology and national security secrecy. All this has streamlined the rigging processes. The mechanisms of corruption have been solidified. So, bottom line, the global imperial elite have very effectively torched the U.S. Constitution and usurped the sovereignty of the American people. So these are several fundamental dynamics, several aspects of how trillions of our tax dollars have gone unaccounted for, how our government has been rigged against American taxpayers, making it even easier for the global imperial elite to control our systems of governance and loot trillions of our tax dollars. There is much more that needs to be said. We're just going over the fundamental dynamics now, laying the foundation for you here. as a side note, the historically accurate term, the technical term for what is happening now is called legalized plunder. Legalized plunder is historically the point in which governmental corruption becomes the norm, when corruption reaches a terminal stage, when the policy and lawmaking process is itself rigged and the law itself is used as a weapon of oppression. So you get corruptly implemented laws that legalize corrupt behavior, which is what we have now. It's technically called legalized plunder. That's the historically accurate term for what is presently unfolding. I'll get deeper into that whole concept in future podcasts. I don't want to get too far off the primary topics of this podcast here now. Being that we did jump ahead a bit into Cambridge Analytica and into the Cambridge Analytica scandal and surveillance tech in general, let me just jump a bit deeper into psychological operations now. So the Cambridge Analytica scandal also exposed the inner workings of how propaganda and present-day psychological operations, PSYOPs, now work as well. Cambridge Analytica used social media data, Facebook data, credit card data, online searches, emails, text, online browsing data. They used these big data analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence algorithms to craft very specific, targeted messaging based on what each individual person does, what each individual person likes and doesn't like. They know your every desire and every fear. And look, this is no dystopian conspiracy theory. This is well-proven reality. Cambridge Analytica's CEO talked about all this in incredible, shocking, mind-blowing detail. He said that they have psychometrics, personality models, and personal profiles on every adult in the United States, and that they have an astounding 5,000 data points on each individual in the United States. This is the latest evolution in propaganda, PR, psychological operations, PSYOPs, that are part of the full spectrum dominance deployed against us, deployed against the American people. It's called psychometrics now. They have thousands of data points, highly detailed personality profiles on everyone. PSYOPs experts, intelligence agencies, large advertising companies, PR firms, and private military contractors use machine learning, AI algorithms to create very detailed profiles on every American. So they know exactly how to manipulate us. Cambridge Analytica's CEO talked about all this in detail. They bragged about it, actually. And there are many companies that have this data as well. Cambridge Analytica was one company of many who do this now. Cambridge Analytica is definitely not the only company to use everything we do online, everything you do on your cell phone, on your credit card against you, to deceive you into supporting things you otherwise wouldn't support. That's the whole point. To deceive you into supporting things you otherwise wouldn't support. You know, there's so much that really needs to be said and laid out on this very important topic. Let me just say this now. In a significant way, our computers and mobile devices are an externalization and extension of our minds. And our cell phones are now deeply infiltrated by artificial intelligence, AI, algorithmic bots, and PSYOPs agents who manipulate your personal information. Make no mistake, they can, as Cambridge Analytica's director said, they can drop the bucket further down the well of your consciousness than you realize. And they may indeed know your hopes and fears better than you do. I know that sounds absurd, sounds crazy, right? If you think this is an exaggeration or some futuristic dystopian conspiracy theory, it's time to wake up. We are not in Kansas anymore, people. Psychometrics, big data, and social psychology. Throughout this series, we will go deep into how PSYOPs experts very effectively manipulate and control people and how they control public opinion in general. I spent significant time analyzing PSYOPs and propaganda dynamics. It's such a big issue that needs a deep dive. In the overall context of this recording, the point that should be made more clearly right now, the American people have been conditioned to be incredibly naive when it comes to power politics and how power operates globally. When your country emerges as the world's number one superpower, when your country amasses more power than any nation in the history of civilization, you can be assured that every power-addicted force on the planet will seek to co-opt and control all government agencies and governmental processes, our economic processes, our military, our intel and national security apparatus, our communication and information systems, even our voting systems are seriously compromised. America has been co-opted and is being extracted across the board. Becoming the world's preeminent superpower put a major target on the back of the American people. And we're just beginning to feel the consequences and blowback from that now. Every government agency that was created to protect the American people against predatory global interests is now being run by the predatory global interests that they are supposed to be protecting us from. This is a fundamental understanding that every American needs to grasp. This will be a main theme throughout the series. Every government agency that was created to protect the American people against predatory global interests is now being run by the predatory global interests that they are supposed to be protecting us from. I have many examples of this that I will be getting into. The systematic, tactical dismantling of the American people's support systems has been shocking. Predatory global interests, the global imperial elite, are systematically tactically dismantling the American people's support systems with shocking precision. If defense wins championships, the American people are in serious trouble, to make a sports metaphor. From what I can see, the primary problem is that the American people are so heavily propagandized. We are saturated in divide and conquer propaganda. The mainstream media is a divide and conquer distraction machine. The American people are conditioned to play checkers. Republicans versus Democrats, liberals versus conservatives. Meanwhile, the global imperial elite are playing full spectrum dominance. Americans are fighting amongst each other. They are fighting over Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. They are playing checkers. Meanwhile, the global imperial elite are controlling both political parties. They own the mainstream media, large online companies, and big banks. They control the intel apparatus, the national security state. This is what I mean by full spectrum dominance. It is a military strategy. And again, it is global imperialism 101. You divide the local population, you saturate the local population in divide and conquer propaganda and make them fight amongst each other, while you rob their natural resources and national wealth, while you rig the systems of governance and turn the national economic system against the local population, while you buy up and control their media and information systems and loot their tax dollars. This is exactly what the global imperialists have done throughout the third world, the second developing world, and now it is happening throughout the first world, throughout Europe and the US. It's happening now. The global centralizing force, the imperial seed, has blossomed and come full circle. The global imperial centralizing force. In the past, the forces of imperialism had some sense of loyalty to their local nation states. However, now the imperial elite have become truly global. They don't have any loyalty to any one nation state anymore. The global imperial elite are now fully independent of any nation states. At this point in the game, the whole world is ripe for exploitation. Even the first world nations like EU nations, Western nations, and the United States is the number one target now. It's no surprise that the U.S. is now the world's top oil and gas exporter. Our country is being raped and pillaged. Our country's natural resources are being looted. Our country is being looted and polluted in unprecedented fashion right now. They can't extract and loot our natural resources fast enough right now. Our natural resource extraction rates have skyrocketed to all-time highs now, and they are polluting our land in unprecedented fashion in the process. Water supplies are being contaminated all over the country. It is a smash and grab imperial heist straight up. We are leading the world in energy exports now by a significant margin. Do the math. 2 + 2 equals imperial heist. Even our strategic petroleum reserve is being sold off now. That is our emergency supply, and they want to get rid of half of it as quickly as possible. Right now, when we need it most. It's a joke. The global imperial elite are seizing control of our energy supply. It is an imperial heist. It's sad. It's seriously sad. Americans don't have any serious leadership. We don't have any legit capable leadership when it comes to real power. Our politicians are either in on the rackets that extract wealth and resources, or they are out to lunch and or conveniently inept. Some are scared of surveillance tech. Some are blackmailed and bribed. However you want to view it, there's no serious leadership in this country anymore. There is no serious strategic defense against predatory global interests. As we discussed, every government agency designed to protect us against predatory global interests is now run by the predatory global interests that they are supposed to be protecting us from. The American people are now defenseless. The divide and conquer and all the divisive rhetoric that is being spewed all throughout the mainstream media and large online companies, this is exactly how they destabilize the Middle East to rob those countries. They used media and communication systems to flood local populations with divide and conquer psychological operations that stoked sectarian conflicts and tribalism. They pitted the Sunnis versus the Shiites. They stoked tribalism, regional identity politics, while they armed local populations. This is how imperial forces destabilized the region. So while local regional conflicts brew and spread throughout the Middle East, the global imperialists rob their resources and wealth and bury these local populations in debt. This is the way imperialism works. And this is exactly what is happening throughout the United States now. It is blatant. And look at who has to pay for the oppression and robbing of Middle East resources. The global imperialists get the resources, and American taxpayers foot the bill. The war on terror is a front for global imperialists who are looting the planet. Middle East populations pay the price with their lives. American soldiers pay the price with shattered minds, PTSD, and record-breaking suicide rates. And American taxpayers foot the bill and get buried in trillions of dollars of debt. Two-time Congressional Medal of Honor winner Major General Butler summed it up well. War is a racket, a global imperial racket now. The war on terror is a front for a global imperial racket, and we are all just beginning to pay the price. The bill is just starting to come due. The war on terror has been a breeding ground for evil, and this evil breeding ground has been brewing and growing for over 17 years now. Trillions in wealth and resources have been looted. Over 1 million people have been killed. Not to mention all the suicides and PTSD. Shattered bodies and shattered minds as the never-ending war rages on, as the global imperial racket rages on. And as I covered in my war reports, they are dropping bombs at a record-breaking pace now. On average, 121 bombs are dropped every day. Just think about that fact. The last time stats were publicly available, they were dropping an average of 121 bombs a day, every single day, 365 days a year. Over 44,000 bombs were dropped in 1 year. Talk about mind-blowing We live in surreal times. The unthinkable has become normalized. Just look at how divisive things are now throughout the U.S. Republican versus Democrat, liberal versus conservative, white versus black, cops versus inner city Americans, women versus men. Identity politics of every kind is everywhere. And it's all stoked by divide and conquer psyops. And look, I don't mean to dismiss identity politics in any way. There is definitely racism and sexism in many different ways. I've reported on institutional racism, classism, sexism. That's the thing, right? In a society overrun with corruption, the overwhelming majority of the population is going to feel oppressed to varying degrees, and rightfully so. In a society overrun with corruption, the overwhelming majority of the population will feel very frustrated and taken advantage of, and rightfully so. People feel like the government and economy are rigged against them because it is. Most demographics throughout the American population have very legitimate complaints and well-justified angst. Absolutely. So I don't mean to downplay identity politics. When your government is systemically corrupt, the population will become an intensely emotional powder keg. And this makes it even easier to manipulate them and stoke divide and conquer propaganda. This is the vicious cycle of imperialism. So from this perspective, identity politics, like tribal politics throughout the Middle East, it is stoked, exacerbated, and driven by divide and conquer propaganda. Divide and conquer psyops, psychological operations, which is part of full spectrum dominance. From a psychological operations perspective, identity politics are designed to silo off segments of the population into the smallest possible demographics to keep them fighting amongst each other, while imperial forces rob and exploit the targeted nation or region. So at its core, identity politics, or the stoking of wedge issues, that is textbook divide and conquer psyops. Straight up psychological operations that are a key strategic piece of full spectrum dominance. The mainstream media throughout the US and large online companies are all dominated by divide and conquer psyops now. I know that sounds extreme to say, right? It sounds like some kind of conspiracy theory, and I understand why people may just dismiss this without looking into it. But it is very easy to see once you understand the fundamentals of how power operates globally. Once you understand how power operates on a global scale, from a global perspective, once you understand how imperialism works, it's easy to see. And that's the thing. The average hardworking American doesn't have the time it takes to investigate, research, and analyze power dynamics on a global scale. And the mainstream media keeps the focus on such a limited spectrum of thought, such a narrow range of understanding. People need to get a wider view, a deeper understanding. They need to expand their awareness globally and sharpen their focus to the top of the global power pyramid. The mainstream media keeps everyone focused on the bottom of the power pyramid. It takes time to get a wider, deeper perspective. It takes significant time hardworking Americans simply don't have. There is no way someone who works full-time and has a family to take care of, there is no way they're going to have the time, energy, or the psychological bandwidth that is necessary to get an in-depth view of complex global power dynamics. And that is exactly where you can see that journalism is dead in the United States and how the mainstream media is divide and conquer 101. You get all this heated debate among a narrow liberal versus conservative spectrum. You get this very limited range of debate between Republican and Democratic talking points, which covers a tiny narrow range of the issue. Meanwhile, all the wider context is left out of the debate. All that wider context that is left out, that is where all the systemic corruption is taking place. That's where the global imperial plunder is happening. The wider context that is left out, that is where the real action is at. This is where the systemic corruption is at. That's where the real power is at. The biggest bias in the mainstream media is revealed in what they choose not to cover. You can see the bias in the mainstream media by what they choose to cover and what they choose not to cover. More importantly, you can see the bias in what they choose not to cover, right? Don't primarily look for the bias in the issue that they are covering. Look for the bias in the decisions on what they are choosing to cover in the first place, right? Most people think, okay, this issue that they are covering, are they covering it with a liberal or conservative slant? Most people think in terms of playing checkers. But the real most important bias is revealed in everything they are not covering. The real most important bias is revealed in what they are choosing to leave out and not cover at all. The mainstream media is bullshit on repetition and censorship by omission. You can see it for yourself. Just think about an issue that you know a lot about and look at how the mainstream media covers it, or if they even really cover it at all. The more you understand about an issue, when you get into the fundamental dynamics of it, into the deeper root causes of why these issues are happening to begin with, you'll clearly see that the mainstream media doesn't even cover it. The mainstream media is now a vast propaganda system that is fundamentally designed to distract, misinform, divide, and confuse the American people. The mainstream media is a divide and conquer distraction machine. When it comes to the core fundamental issues of systemic corruption, which are the underlying dynamics of the major problems confronting the American people today, when it comes to how real power operates, that is never discussed in the mainstream media. And if it is mentioned at all, it is mentioned in passing. And if anything that truly affects real power is mentioned in the mainstream media, it is time to quickly cut to commercial, and the person who mentioned it is either fired or never invited back as a guest. You are only allowed into the mainstream media if you uphold the Republican versus Democrat dynamic, the liberal versus conservative dynamic. If you go beyond that into the deeper dynamics of systemic corruption, which both parties are up to their eyes in, including the companies who own the large media companies as well, if you can effectively pierce through the divide and conquer Republican versus Democrat limited spectrum of thought, You are not allowed into the mainstream media. That is the way it works. I mean, it's so blatant now. It's like watching a cartoon, right? Sane people who have a basic understanding of how power operates globally, they don't watch the TV news anymore. It's a joke. And most of talk show radio is even worse than TV news. Talk show radio is cartoonish divide and conquer propaganda as well. It's so sad, though, because many people still get their information from TV and radio. And I definitely don't blame people who get all worked up after listening to TV and radio propaganda. I understand why it's happening. For about 7 years, I worked with Danny Schechter, the news dissector, as he was known. R.I.P. Danny. Danny was a very well-credentialed TV news journalist. As a TV news producer, he won Emmy Awards. He worked at ABC News 2020. He was part of the startup team at CNN. He had all sorts of mainstream media journalism cred. He was also a Neiman Journalism Fellow at Harvard. He taught at Columbia Journalism School. Anyhow, he ended up leaving his job in the mainstream TV media once all the news companies were getting bought up and were being consolidated into larger global corporations. Danny was deep inside the mainstream media machine, and he saw firsthand how journalism was being systematically destroyed. So he quit and wrote a book about the inner workings of the mainstream TV news. And he called the book, "The More You Watch, the Less You Know." And wow, ain't that the truth? He summed it up in 8 words. The more you watch, the less you know. If you watch mainstream media, if you pay attention to mainstream news narratives, to what they are covering, you get further and further removed from reality. The more you watch, the less you know. TV and radio news is designed to dumb you down and make you confused. It's designed to distract you and make you all fearful and emotionally worked up, to short circuit your neocortex, your critical thinking skills, and to fire up your reptilian brain, to get you fighting amongst people that you should be aligning with. Anyone who follows the narratives set by the mainstream media is lost. So even most of the so-called independent media, they're just reinforcing mainstream media narratives. Underfunded, understaffed, independent and nonprofit news organizations focus most of their efforts on trying to give slightly more context to issues that the mainstream media is already covering. So they end up reinforcing mainstream narratives. They end up reinforcing narratives created by the mainstream media. Everyone pays attention to Trump's latest tweets, identity politics, the border wall, Russia, 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 Trump, Trump, Trump. These are all important, but they are symptoms of a corrupt system. Mainstream media narratives, at best, they focus on symptoms of the corrupt system. And they always ignore the corrupt system that produces these symptoms. They keep the focus on the bottom of the power pyramid. They keep the focus on the symptoms of the corrupted system, not on the core fundamentals of the system that is causing the problems. Most everything in the mainstream media, most everything the mainstream media focuses on is a colossal distraction. There's that old insightful quote that I updated once from the famous French sociologist Gabriel Tardet, if that's how you even pronounce his name. In the late 1800s, he said that newspapers set off the conversations of individuals, even those who do not read papers, but who, talking to those who do, are forced to follow the groove of their borrowed thoughts. And he then concludes by saying that one pen suffices to set off 1,000 tongues, right? He was summing up the power of the pen back then. Well, if one pen sets off 1,000 tongues, one TV sets off millions of minds. And that's so true. So now that I brought up my old friend Danny Schechter, one of the first projects I worked on with Danny was a documentary called WMD, Weapons of Mass Deception, which was about how the TV news media became a propaganda system during the run-up to the Iraq War. Before the invasion even began, before the shock and awe bombing campaign even started, we interviewed weapons inspectors who were monitoring weapons inside Iraq. They showed us their reports saying that Iraq didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. They showed us their reports saying that Iraq didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. Now, keep in mind, this was before the shock and awe campaign even started, before the invasion even began. We reported on the false intel on Iraq's alleged involvement in 9/11 before the invasion even began. This was all known before the war started. But the mainstream media ignored all this vital info. We knew that Ahmed Chalabi, the so-called Iraqi dissident who provided false WMD intel and false intel linking Saddam to 9/11 and Al-Qaeda, it turned out that Chalabi was actually on SAIC's payroll. SAIC is an incredibly powerful global private military contractor. Then we watched as Baghdad fell, and the new Iraqi government was then run by SAIC. Literally, once Baghdad fell, SAIC took over the country, literally. They even made Ahmed Chalabi, Mr. False Intel, they made him the Iraqi oil minister. It was such blatant imperialism. The guy who provided all the false intel to wrongfully justify the invasion, that guy, he was put in charge of Iraq's oil supply. He became the Iraqi oil minister. I mean, you couldn't even make this stuff up. It's a cheesy, over the top movie plot. It was such blatant imperialism. Anyhow, SAIC set up the Iraqi media network, which became Iraq's mainstream media system, and they began to stoke sectarian and tribal conflicts, while they helped deploy divide and conquer psyops to create and exacerbate sectarian conflicts, tribal conflicts throughout the region. The Iraqi police forces were armed, and then they fired those police officers, leaving them with no job prospects or ability to support their families. This was right after they gave them all sorts of weapons. What does 2 plus 2 equal? In Iraq, the plan all along was to create civil wars throughout the region. The plan was to create terrorist groups so they could destabilize the region. Creating groups like ISIS was the exact plan. And it is still paying off for them to this day, courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer. It's a never-ending racket. The never-ending war racket robbing trillions from the U.S. Treasury. Paul Bremer, do you remember him? Paul Bremer, he was installed as the Iraqi viceroy, and he did everything he could to destabilize the Iraqi population, all with SAIC's help. They stoked tribal and sectarian conflicts. It was barbaric imperialism 101. It was a horrifyingly grotesque display of barbaric imperial greed. And U.S. taxpayers are still pouring billions upon billions annually into this imperial heist. It's the gift that just keeps giving. I don't want to get too deep into Iraq right now. Covering all that in such detail was a horrible experience. Seriously traumatizing. It was such a grotesque display of barbaric imperial greed. I definitely don't want to get into that now. I'm digressing a bit here anyway. Bottom line, though, and this is what scares me. What happened throughout Iraq and the Middle East is very similar to what is happening, to what is beginning to unfold here in the United States now. It is unfolding on a much more incremental scale here, though. You can look at Iraq and the destabilization of the Middle East, of Middle Eastern nations, as experimental operations where they hone their skills for what is being incrementally, tactically deployed throughout the U.S. and Europe now. I don't want to sound overly conspiratorial. I don't think that this is one group with some master plan or anything like that. Based on what I know, it is not so simple and black and white like that at all. But I do think it is a fundamental dynamic of the overall global centralizing imperial system. The imperial seed is blossoming, coming full circle. It's a self-perpetuating global centralizing force that has taken on a life of its own, a momentum of its own. I'll get into what I mean by a self-perpetuating global centralizing force and the imperial seed blossoming throughout this series. I'll actually spend significant time on that. For now, let's just look at all the similar dynamics unfolding here in the U.S. that happened throughout Iraq and the Middle East. What happened there is very similar to what is happening here in the United States now. We are flooded in this divide and conquer propaganda, in tribal identity politics. The U.S. is also flooded with guns and weapons now throughout the civilian population. And they have militarized police forces all throughout the U.S. now as well. At this point here in the U.S., they can't even produce bullets fast enough to keep up with demand now. People are stockpiling weapons all over the country. And don't get me wrong here. I'm not anti-Second Amendment rights. I understand how tyrannical governments can get, as we've been discussing. It's just that this strategy, it's a power play that we've seen clearly before. Flood the local population with weapons, militarize the police, then stoke divide and conquer propaganda, identity politics, wedge issues. And while the population fights with each other, global imperial forces rob their resources and wealth and bury the population in debt. Debt is a key part. And look, we now have all-time record-breaking debt across the board. National debt is at an all-time high now. And it just keeps skyrocketing exponentially now. State debt is at an all-time high now. Household debt is at an all-time high now. And personal debt is at an all-time high now. Our overall debt is skyrocketing now. It is an imperial death spiral. Debt is the imperialist's ultimate weapon, an effective and efficient weapon. So debt and divide and conquer propaganda are the imperialist's 1-2 punch. I mean, seriously now, just do a serious analysis of our present overall situation. It's not very surprising that the U.S. is now the world's top oil and gas producer. In 2018, petroleum production increased by 1.3 million barrels per day. By 1.3 million barrels per day. Quite the smash and grab imperial heist, don't you think? And Congress has now decided to sell off 290 million barrels of our strategic petroleum reserve. Given the strategic importance of keeping our energy reserve supplies after recent extreme weather events, after major storms caused us to use more of our strategic petroleum reserve recently, it is shocking that we would now decide to cut our strategic petroleum reserve in half now. That is leaving us wide open and exposed for when new disasters strike. It's imperial plunder. As we've discussed before, our natural resources are being looted for pennies on the dollar at record-breaking extraction rates. It's such a smash and grab heist. Our land is being polluted in the process in unprecedented fashion. Water supplies are being contaminated in communities across the entire country. I'll go into detail on all this. It's a free-for-all smash and grab heist across the entire government, an all-out imperial heist. I can't say it enough. And look closely at it, right? The Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Land Management, the agencies who oversee our natural resources, they are being run by people who worked with the companies that are currently looting our natural resources for pennies on the dollar. Corruption's running amok. It's happening across the board. The revolving door is spinning between predatory global interests and every sector of our government that is supposed to be protecting us against those predatory global interests. It's a fundamental dynamic that everyone needs to understand. And it's not very surprising that tax dollars are being looted by the trillions throughout our entire tax system now. It's not very surprising that national and state debt has skyrocketed to all-time record-breaking levels, as have household and personal debt. It's not very surprising that the government and economic systems are rigged. It's not very surprising that identity politics and all sorts of divisive rhetoric are being spewed throughout the mainstream media. It's not very surprising that guns are flooding our streets as police forces are militarized. 2 + 2 equals what? It's basic math. We've seen this tyrannical power play many times before, too many times. So back to what I was saying was the primary problem. This is all happening because the journalistic societal guidance systems throughout the United States have been decapitated. The journalistic societal guidance systems that are supposed to inform and warn the American people about all this, those guidance systems have been destroyed. They have been systemically undermined. Journalism is dead throughout the U.S. The journalistic societal guidance systems throughout the U.S. have been decapitated. Getting back to the original point, if you are an average American worker, you don't have the time it takes to understand the wider societal power dynamics. If you are working full-time, taking care of your family, there is no way that you have the time it takes, the energy and the psychological bandwidth left over after working and taking care of your family. After a long day, it's not like you're going to investigate and research complex issues and analyze wider societal power dynamics on a global scale. It's not going to happen. So this is where real journalism is supposed to step in to fill the void, to serve this critical societal function, to be a vital societal guidance system. Real journalism provides vital information to people so they can make wise decisions that affect their lives and largely determine their fate, their family's future. So with this vital societal guidance system dismantled, people are easily manipulated by propagandists, by psychological operations experts, by PR firms, by Democratic and Republican talking points that are repetitiously reinforced throughout the mainstream media and large online companies, and by artificial intelligence algorithms now, which are incredibly effective with specifically tailored messaging based on an individual basis now. The AI algobots are no joke. They edit your reality in real time. They are Orwellian thought police on steroids. It sounds crazy. And it is crazy. But it's true. The AI algobots will make you think exactly what powerful interests want you to think. With incredible precision now. They know exactly how you think, what you like and don't like. As Cambridge Analytica's director said, they can drop the bucket further down the well of your consciousness than you realize, and they may indeed know your hopes and fears better than you do. It all sounds crazy. I know it does. I really do. For now, I just want to make it clear to people that real journalism is dead in this country. Real investigative journalism is hard work, very time consuming, and it is a high wire act. Powerful people, powerful interests do not like people reporting on their corrupt activities, obviously. But doing it independently now, you don't have the backing of any large news organizations anymore. You are forced to do it without resources and any significant backing. I fought hard, a 20-year, ever-evolving battle to get this far. This is no joke. It's a high wire act. It's a high stress, high risk, high wire act. And it doesn't pay well at all. It's an enormous risk. And in the grand scheme of things, you're just this little gnat, a gadfly. Honestly, I don't know how I've made it this far. But I can tell you, it's been a hard-fought, ever-evolving battle. That's for damn sure. Based on everything that I can see, the American people are defenseless at this point. We are exposed. Our defenses, our support systems have been systematically dismantled. Where is the legit leadership? Where is the effective leadership? I've been looking and I don't see it. People who understand power well enough, who care about the overall well-being of the American people, those people, those voices are being systematically wiped out, snuffed out. People who put the overall well-being of the American people before cashing out to the global imperial elite, they are in short supply. They are a shrinking demographic within the government as well. When you go beyond the Republican versus Democrat dynamic and focus on the fundamentals of corruption, when you defend the American people against predatory global interests, you are kept out of the mainstream media. You get hacked, you get censored and suppressed online. They undermine your ability to make a living at doing investigative journalism. The main point here, journalists who can report on systemic corruption in a way that can overcome divide and conquer narratives and unite the American people, journalists who can report on systemic corruption in a way that unites Americans, they are kept out of the mainstream media and they are targeted for hacking and online censorship and many forms of suppression. Journalists who can report on systemic corruption in a way that unites Americans and informs them on the fundamentals of real power. Those journalists are targeted, and the primary objective is to make it impossible for them to make a living at doing that reporting. That is the bottom line. Make it impossible for investigative journalists to make a living. Honestly, at this point, there's no way you can just work part-time and do a serious investigation into power and get people to actually notice it. People are bombarded by so much bullshit. There's so much noise. Real investigative journalism is incredibly hard work, time-consuming, high-pressure work. At this point, it is too risky, too costly. It takes a heroic effort just to do it over the short run. The sustainability that is needed is not there anymore. The support systems have been dismantled. So the journalistic guidance systems have been destroyed. And now the American people are lost out to sea. We did have this brief window of opportunity with the internet. Journalists who had a deeper understanding of systemic corruption and could cut through the divide and conquer narratives were able to thrive online for a while. But now, the Iron Curtain is coming down online. Voices who can cut through the divide and conquer narratives are being hacked, censored, and suppressed on a much wider scale and in much more sophisticated ways now. I mean, at the most basic level, now if you can cut through the Republican versus Democrat divide and conquer narratives, they smear you as being a Russian bot of some kind or something like that, right? That whole prop or not psyop, that was the beginning of the end for even the most basic independent online journalists. I do think the biggest reason why I'm hacked and censored online is because I focus on systemic corruption in a way that has united people. The supporters I have, the people who support my work, are people with opinions across the political spectrum, across many demographics. Systemic corruption has gotten so bad now, most demographics are feeling the negative impacts in various ways. No one wants to have their tax dollars stolen. No one wants to have their water supply contaminated. No one wants to eat toxic food. No one wants to pay twice as much for health care as any other nation pays. The corrupt global imperial elite interests who are robbing our tax dollars and our nation's wealth, they don't care what your political perspective or ideological viewpoint is. It's not like they are only stealing tax dollars and wealth from liberals and not conservatives. It's not like they distinguish between looting the wealth of conservatives or liberals, the old or the young, women or men. Global imperialists don't discriminate in any way. They will rob anyone and everyone. All right, look, I'll wrap up this second session, this second podcast. I'll wrap it up right now. I know these first few sessions are very long form. I'm sure they're too long for everyone's ever-shortening attention spans. I'm trying to lay a solid foundation of understanding here before I get into shorter, more issue-specific, topic-oriented news-style posts. You know, we need to flesh out wider context, and that takes time. I'll get better at being more concise, I definitely will, to accurately articulate what is presently unfolding as concisely as possible in a way that a large number of people can understand it. That's where the action is at. That's the primary objective here. And let me close by saying this. Look, I know we have covered a lot of negative, dark issues here in this podcast. As I've said throughout the first podcast, we are going to do a lot of shadow work here. We are going to illuminate the shadow, illuminate the dark side. We are going to shine a light on the shadows that be. As Carl Jung advised, we need to make the darkness conscious so we can adequately confront our collective shadow and evolve in a holistically healthy, sustainable way. So we can transcend the old, corrupted, global, centralizing paradigm. So we can shed that old skin and enter a new paradigm of prosperity, freedom, health, and unprecedented abundance. How's that sound? Sounds pretty good. It's doable. It's doable, people. I'm making these recordings now because I believe that once people can understand these fundamental dynamics of systemic corruption, once a critical mass knows where to focus their attention, focus their efforts, we can fix this. The hour is late, no doubt. But once people can understand the fundamental dynamics of it, we can create the change that we need. We can absolutely fix this. We now understand the fundamental dynamics of it in such detail. We know what's happening. We know how it is happening. We know how to fix it. For all the major problems we face, there are now viable solutions. This is what I'm going to be laying out here in this series for you. I wouldn't be doing this right now if I didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel. Despite all the systemic corruption and the challenges that we face, there is much to be positive about. We need to empower and shine a bright light on inspector generals. Right? Let me say this again. We need to empower and shine a bright light on inspector generals. That is a key strategic imperative right now. Please consider focusing your political efforts on inspector generals and systemic corruption. This is a critical, vital, strategic step that we have to take if we're going to get out of this mess. Let's shine a bright light on inspector generals. Let's get investigations into systemic corruption kicked into full gear. Let's support and encourage whistleblowers so they can help us expose all this systemic corruption that is quickly closing in on us. We can fix this, but the hour is late for optimistic outcomes. Who hears me? Does anyone hear me? Is this thing on? Is this thing on? This thing better have been recording for the past 20 hours. Mic check. Mic check. Is this thing on? Mic check. This is on. Turn it up. Turn it up. Mic check. Turn it up. All right. I'm getting a little silly now. All right. Let's take a break for a bit, and then I'll unleash another hour or so to close out day one with 3 podcasts loaded up in the arsenal. Wait. I should probably request that people listening to this become paying subscribers or donate some money now at this point. As I've been expressing here in detail, I'm fighting a very serious, ever-evolving battle over here. The only way I can sustain this effort is from getting some fuel and support directly from you, the very wise people who care about what I'm reporting on here. So if you appreciate the work, please show some love and support by subscribing in any amount that you feel inspired to contribute. If you are tapped in enough to be listening to this right now, if you can hear my voice, please consider subscribing in support of this effort. I am 100% independent over here, as you can tell. I am a believer in positive feedback loops. The more you empower others, the more empowered you become. That's the driving ethos over here. Let's get a positive feedback loop going here. All right. Thanks for listening. I'll be back for round 3 soon, We're just getting started. We can fix this, people. We will fix this. The future is bright. Obstacles and adversity fuel our potential.